Okie dokie, Tuborowski. It's time for yet another installment of Flame, so-called facts and logic about the Middle East, the running propaganda series run by the State of Israel's dummy front, as serialized in The Nation magazine. This newest installment of Howlers and Clinkers comes to you courtesy of the combined first and eighth issue of this month. So, Jesus, where to begin? Well, this is it. First of all, it quotes this: "As the prophet Isaiah presaged, Israel is indeed a light unto the nations." That is this month's theme. Okay, we'll begin here. Those who demonize Israel are either misinformed or malevolent. If that proverbial man from Mars came to visit and read the world's newspapers, especially those in the Arab and Muslim world, he would be convinced that Israel was the most evil nation in the world and the source of all the world's strife. Well, the strawman Martian, if he bothered looking at Earth's media in toto, would see that one sector of the planet is constantly demonizing some other. Israel is demonizing the Arab Islamic world. Iran calls the USA the Great Satan. The USA called the USSR the evil empire, and now joins Israel in demonizing the ragheads, and on and ho-hum. Israel just gets bashed the same as anyone else. Boo effing who. What are the facts? Which we're not likely to find here, but I continue. A nation to be emulated. The reality, of course, is that Israel is a nation, a society that should be admired and emulated by many countries in the world. Many? Like which ones? Uzbekistan? Rwanda? Bolivia? I have a gut feeling them kind of places wasn't in the mind of this writer, but anyway. The very fact of how the State of Israel came into being is one of the most inspiring in history. Born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, it has emerged as one of the most advanced, productive, and prosperous in the world. By ethnic cleansing at gunpoint? Well, anyway, yeah, the ashes of the Holocaust. Well, first, there's no doubt that Palestine/Israel was a safe haven for many Holocaust survivors who no longer cared to live in the likes of Poland or Romania. The truth is that most of these folks would have preferred to emigrate to an already developed location in the English-speaking world, but were prevented from doing just that by racist immigration quotas in the USA and the British Commonwealth. No more goofy left-wing Jews in London's East End or Manhattan, please. I'm sure Churchill was still having nightmares about the Sydney Street Massacre of 1911, so channeling these DPs to Palestine was in the self-interest of both the West and the World Zionist Organization. Nothing new there, because before the war, the WZO collaborated with Hitler for exactly the same ends. In 1933, when Hitler's regime was young and vulnerable and undergoing a boycott that could have brought the fledgling Nazi regime down, this boycott was broken by the World Zionist Organization because it wanted to participate with Chancellor Hitler in the so-called transfer agreement, whereby Jewish property was transferred to the German government, then from Germany to the then Mandate Palestine as German export, all to encourage Jewish immigration there too. This means the WZO was profiting off Hitler's anti-Semitism, just as Hitler's government was profiting off Jewish property. And to encourage Palestinian settlement via this agreement, they had to break the anti-Nazi boycott organized by Jews and anti-fascists in the US and Britain. The WZO put its political interests over the fate of German Jews in 1933, allowed Hitler to survive his first insecure months, and opened the doors to the Holocaust a decade later. Yeah, inspiring stuff indeed. The demonization of Israel, assiduously cultivated by the Muslim world. Wait a minute. Let me back up just a track here. Born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, it has emerged as one of the most advanced, productive, and prosperous countries in the world. Okay, is that why people are quietly leaving and returning to the U.S. and Europe, leaving Israel to fake Jewish immigrants from Russia? Anyway. Continuing, the demonization of Israel, assiduously cultivated by the Muslim world, has reached a crescendo following Israel's 2008 defensive action in Gaza. Defensive action, huh? Not what the Goldstone report said. It is what Hitler said about the invasion of Poland, though. Wait, I'm jumping ahead. Instead of being grateful to the hated Jews for having totally withdrawn, the Palestinian Gazans showed their gratitude by almost daily pounding Israeli towns with close to 10,000 rockets and bombs. After countless warnings, Israel ultimately decided to put an end to this travesty. Well, maybe the hated Jews wouldn't have been so hated if they hadn't invaded in the first place. What's to be grateful for? You don't break and enter my house? Good, asshole, is what you're supposed not to do. You don't get a special reward for not giving into some criminal instinct and doing the right thing by your neighbor. As to warnings, well, I think we could count the warnings well enough if we had to, as well as the provocations Israel indulged in to provoke the very pretext it wanted and needed for its defensive action. When Israel finally did invade Gaza, it took the most elaborate precautions not to hurt civilians. As the first in the history of warfare, Israel dropped tens of thousands of leaflets warning the population and urging it to abandon areas in which military action would take place. The Israeli military made thousands of phone calls urging people to leave areas that would come under attack. But fighting in a densely populated government is difficult and loss of civilian life is hard to avoid. Well, right, as if the Palestinians of Gaza don't know you want to bulldoze them out of house and home, that this isn't exactly how Israel redeemed the land in 1947 and 48 on the first go-around. They knew exactly what was behind the so-called humanitarian gesture and weren't about to abandon their homes and land in another round of ethnic cleansing under the fake humanitarian guise of a gun pointed to their heads. But fighting in a densely populated environment is difficult and loss of civilian life is hard to avoid. Well, man, this group must think we're either fucking idiots or they must be. Fighting in a densely populated environment is difficult and loss of civilian life is hard to avoid. I have to go over that one again. You think? So anyway, Hamas fighters wear no uniforms. It is impossible to tell them from civilians. Is a person who allows a rocket launcher in his backyard a civilian or a fighter? So, since you can't tell the fighters from the civilians, you're justified in just killing them all and let Allah sort them out. And how do you disallow armed men from moving onto your property and setting up shop? If they could figure that one out, Israel couldn't have even come into existence, now could it? And how about using schools and mosques, hospitals as munitions depots and staff centers? The hue and cry of Israel's demonizers and accusing it of disproportionate force is totally absurd. The ultimate result, comparing Israel to the Nazis, is freely bandied about by Israel's detractors. Yeah, so that means that some of these schools and hospitals and so forth are misused as military targets. They all must become military targets. Thus, there's no disproportionate force, and turning Gaza into Carthage would be a reasonable, sane, moderate, even humane act on the part of Israel. Am I sure this wasn't written by the Jesuits? The level of casuistry here would do the Inquisition proud. Whoops, and there it was. Well, comparing Israel to Slobodan Milosevic is a more just image than the linkage of Nazis and gas chambers with Israel. But, the German war state of 1938-1939 is indeed an apt comparison. Remember the rhetoric of defensive invasion? Or the USSR having to annex the Baltic states as their weak little selves were just going to let their so-called national territories be a footstool for enemies anyway, right? No thought that one's own behavior is probably the major contributor to the problem you pose. Israel is not an apartheid state. This is such disingenuous bullshit. The author may not know, though I think he does, that South African apartheid was more than just U.S.-style segregation. South Africa had that much back in the 1890s. The apartheid system as it evolved between 1948 and 1994 meant the total separation of South Africa's racial communities into separate so-called homelands, specifically the black homelands of KwaZulu, Ndebeleland, Transkei, etc., whose alleged citizens were not legally South Africans and thus had no claims on the South African state, though South Africa had territorial rights for defense and security in these homelands. This was basically a version of American Indian reservations, which are also theoretically sovereign, so that the mafia can put up casinos outside local, state, and federal gaming laws. That is exactly what Israel has turned the West Bank and Gaza into, carved up Bantustans that have no genuine sovereignty, serving as no more than ghettos to warehouse and police a population too big to just drive away or exterminate, all at once anyway. Want to talk about Hitler again? If the war had ended in 1940, the German-administered ghettos on formerly Polish soil would have looked exactly like the hellhole refugee camps of Gaza. Since the Israeli state controls these native reserve homelands, it has indeed made itself an apartheid state on a South African basis. Israel is the only country in this benighted neighborhood which in which people of all colors and religions prosper and have equal rights. Well, again, this slips into the disingenuous clouding of the issue, deliberately confusing Palestinians in the colonized zones with those still barely remaining within Israel proper. These authors know the difference. They're only trying to exploit your ignorance by feeding you bullshit, which is why you should be as angry with this Weasley tribe as I am. Expanding substantial effort, rescuing tens of thousands of black Jews from Ethiopia, and it has given assistance and absorbed countless Christian expatriates from Sudan who escaped from being slaughtered by their Muslim countrymen. The small print is getting to me. But anyway, how much of that was actually funded by the U.S. as part of the American strategy to control the East African side of Middle East oil shipping lanes? That is not mentioned in this particular piece. Israel's over 1 million Arab citizens enjoy the same rights and privileges as their Jewish fellows. They are represented in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, and are members of its bureaucracy, of its judiciary, and of its diplomatic service. But not in open electoral politics, but as community representatives. They are usually vetted by the Israeli government long before they are allowed to represent their people in the Knesset. They do not run at large. They don't represent any Jews. They serve for the most part as official token Uncle Toms. Just let them get a little too independent in giving voice to their always shrinking Israeli Arab base, and they quickly discover just how short their leash is. Again, just disingenuous, Jesuitical casuistry. All over the world, leftists, including the United States, and sad to say, even in Israel itself, tirelessly condemn and vilify Israel. Why would they do that? First, of course, there is good old-fashioned anti-Semitism. I'll do a Gary on this one. You lying goddamn Weasley fucktard. Show me one. I mean one. Leftist in the U.S. or Israel that engages in old-fashioned anti-Semitism. You lying, fucktard, Weasley pimple-ass son of a toad. This just shows your own Netanyahu lick-pooed bias. The American right contains more nests of real old-fashioned anti-Semitism, but you won't touch them because in public they also keep the dollar spigot flowing to Israel. That's right, the transfer agreement again. Playing footsie under the table with real anti-Semites for your own dollar advantage and drawing attention to straw men elsewhere. That's what this Weasley-ass rag bullshit should be called. Look, up in the sky. It's a fig leaf. No, it's straw man, able to assemble and fall apart at will. Fucking ridiculous. Second, many of those who hate the United States vent their poison on Israel, which they consider being America's puppet in that area of the world. America's puppet? Well, no more than Cuba was of the USSR. Sure, they were allies, but Cuba was always running off getting its ass in a crack on its own, with a weary USSR having to pull its wayward partner from its own messy mess. But Israel should certainly get top grades in all areas important to the left. Why, for all such raging anti-Semites? First you insult us, then seek our support. This wouldn't be written by Rahm Emanuel or someone else on the Obama team by any chance. Anyway. In contrast to all its enemies, Israel has the same democratic institutions as the United States. All religions thrive freely in Israel. Thrive freely? Tell that to the Greek Orthodox monks who had to fight a running battle with state-subsidized settler coups in Jerusalem to keep their property from being colonized and themselves from eviction. There was plenty of media coverage when Greek and Armenian monks brawled in Jerusalem 3 years ago because that serves as a chuckling diversion from the reigning attitude toward religious minorities. Again, they state such bald-ass bullshit because they know you are too lazy to bother getting off yours to find out what's really going on and will remain content to be spoon-fed garbage as in other areas of life. Well, anyway. Also, in contrast to all its enemies, women have the same rights as men. The Chief Justice of Israel's Supreme Court is a woman. 1/6 of the Knesset are women. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, medieval theocracy, where women are not allowed to drive cars, where they cannot leave the country without permission of a male relative, and where they can be, and often are, condemned up to 60 lashes if the modesty police deems them not to be properly dressed in public. Gays and lesbians are totally unmolested in Israel. Well, you might have to ask them about that. I doubt that any one of them wrote this piece. In the surrounding Muslim countries, they would be subjected to the death penalty. Well, inasmuch as there is any truth to these sweeping generalities, it's thanks only to Israel's secular European heritage, not to anything particular to Jewish culture or tradition. To Orthodox Jews, women still have no soul, and the power of the Orthodox community is on the rise in Israel. Orthodox rabbis are mostly the ones who staff the panels deciding what immigrants are Jewish enough to be considered worthy of Israeli citizenship. In spite of demonization and vilification, By so much of the world, Israel is indeed a light unto the nations. The state of Israel is the foremost creation of the Jewish enterprise and Jewish intellect that has benefited every country in which Jews dwell, certainly our own country, the United States. Another round of balderdash. Without outside subsidy, Israel would have collapsed, just as the Zionist settlements would have gone under a century ago without remittances from the WZO and the Rothschild family. Today it's the U.S. taxpayer picking up the tab. You can be double damn sure that while old folks will see their Medicaid and Social Security cut, now school kids will see funded hot lunch programs gutted, the U.S. dollar cash cow will still feed the Israeli military machine because, of course, the Pentagon makes a buku fortune supplying its Mediterranean Cuba with all that it needs to make 2, 3, many South Lebanons. Second only to the United States itself, Israel is the world's most important factor in science and technology, way out of proportion to the small size of its population. Israeli Jews are at the forefront of the arts, the sciences, law, and medicine. They have brought all of these sterling qualities to bear in building their own country, Israel. By necessity, they have also become outstanding in agriculture and, most surprisingly, in the military. Oh, please. Again, this is U.S.-funded research combined with bribing the former Soviet scientific intelligentsia to discover its Jewish roots and live at government expense in Israel, or at the expense of the useful idiots who buy this kind of pabble. Anyway, onwards and downwards. As for agriculture, well, yes, if Israeli agriculture wasn't built on land the Arabs used to cultivate, plowing over their former villages with maybe the remnants of some old mosque rising from a kibbutz field, they might not seek the path of revenge, jihad, and martyrdom. But that only begs the question of Israel being allowed to seek revenge for its sufferings, like after Munich in 1976. But when the Arabs do it, it's because they are bloodlusting savages with vengeance uppermost in their bloody minds, and thus unfit to be self-governing entities in a modern world of light and law and democracy. So anyway, there you have it, another tissue of used Charmin, untangled free of charge. And as always, thank you for using YouTube.